He entered a loveless contract with a rebellious girl, but discovered she was pure on wedding night? Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. He was known across the city as a man without weakness. At 30 years old, Alexander Stone was the type of man who built his empire with precision, discipline, and an unshakable will. He wore suits tailored to perfection, spoke with calculated brevity, and kept his heart locked away behind walls of cold marble. To his business rivals, he was a storm in human form. To the public, he was a symbol of power and control. But to his family, he was merely a tool, a weapon to preserve their legacy. When his grandfather announced that the only way for Alexander to inherit the company was to marry within the year, Alexander did not flinch. Love had never been a part of his vocabulary. To him, marriage was a contract, another business deal to secure his authority and protect his empire. He simply needed a woman who would sign the papers, stand by his side during public appearances, and accept the terms without asking for his heart. That was when fate delivered Isabella Reyes. She was 22, a fire in human form, with eyes that dared the world to challenge her. She was not polished, not refined by society's expectations. She lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, juggling part-time jobs to pay her mother's hospital bills. Life had taught her to be sharp-tongued, quick-witted, and unafraid to rebel against authority. To Alexander's world, she was a nobody. To Alexander's family, she was the worst possible candidate. And that was exactly why she caught his attention. Alexander did not want tenderness. He wanted someone who would sign on the dotted line, someone who would not expect candlelight dinners or whispered promises of devotion. Isabella, desperate to save her mother and with no other way to cover the growing medical expenses, agreed. She did not believe in fairy tales. She believed in survival. The contract was clear. No love, no interference in each other's lives. Just appearances when necessary. For her, it was money for her mother's treatment. For him, it was the company throne. Yet from the moment Isabella entered the towering glass mansion that overlooked the skyline, sparks of conflict began to fly. She despised the suffocating silence of the halls, the way servants bowed as if their spines might break, the cold routines that made the place feel like a gilded prison. She challenged him at dinner, rolled her eyes at his instructions, and called out the arrogance hidden in his every word. Alexander, used to obedience and fear, found himself strangely irritated, but also intrigued. She was rebellious, untamed, and entirely different from the porcelain women he had met at charity galas. She was raw, unpredictable, and yet she carried a strange dignity in her defiance. What neither of them knew was that this agreement, signed without affection, was about to ignite a battle between duty and desire. Every rule they had written would be tested. Every wall Alexander had built would begin to crack. And on the night that should have been their coldest performance, he would discover a truth that would shake his entire world. From the very first morning inside the stone mansion, Isabella felt the crushing weight of her new reality. The house was not a home. It was a palace of glass and stone, towering ceilings that echoed with silence, staircases that seemed built for grand entrances rather than human warmth. Every detail screamed wealth, but not comfort. Servants bowed with rehearsed precision, their eyes trained to avoid hers, as though her very presence was an intrusion. At breakfast, she sat across from Alexander at a table long enough to seat an entire board of directors. A golden chandelier cast its cold light above them, yet the silence was heavier than the marble walls. Alexander skimmed through the morning reports with mechanical ease, barely acknowledging the plate of food in front of him. Isabella, irritated, stabbed at her toast with unnecessary force. Finally, she broke the silence. "So this is it? Meals eaten in silence, like strangers forced into the same room?" Alexander did not even glance up. "This is how I live. If you find it unbearable, you may eat elsewhere. Our contract does not require us to share a table." Her eyes narrowed. "I thought marriage meant two people at least pretending to tolerate each other." His gaze lifted then, sharp as steel. "Marriage, Isabella, in our case, is an arrangement. Pretending has limits. Do not test mine. The servants froze at the tone in his voice, but Isabella only leaned back in her chair and smirked. Relax, Alexander. I am not here to fall in love with you, but do not expect me to play the obedient doll either. It was their first true clash, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Later that week, Alexander took her to a charity gala. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, gowns, and champagne glasses raised by the city's elite. Isabella, in a simple yet elegant dress chosen by his assistant, stood by his side with her chin held high. She could feel the whispers circling her like vultures. Who is she? Why would Alexander Stone bring a girl like that? She looks out of place. She must be after his money. The words were venom, but Isabella refused to bow her head. She smiled at the gossips with deliberate boldness, her eyes daring them to say it louder. When one socialite extended a fake friendly hand and said, "My dear, you must be overwhelmed in such a sophisticated crowd," Isabella's response was sharp enough to cut glass. Overwhelmed? No. Amused, perhaps. It is fascinating how people with so much money can still be so cheap with their manners. Gasps rippled through the circle. Alexander's jaw tightened, expecting disaster. But then, something unexpected flickered in his chest. Respect. For the first time, he did not see her as a reckless rebel, but as a woman unafraid to defend her dignity. She stood her ground in a world designed to crush her, and that stubborn flame unsettled him in ways he had not anticipated. That night, as their limousine pulled away from the gala, Alexander finally spoke. His voice was low, but the edge of command had softened. "You should be careful. Words like that can make enemies." "Oh," Isabella turned her face toward the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "Enemies or not, at least they know I will not bow." For a man like Alexander, used to submission and control, her defiance was both infuriating and strangely magnetic. He told himself it was annoyance. But in truth, it was the beginning of something he could not yet name. Living under the same roof was never meant to be easy. From the moment Isabella moved into the Stone mansion, daily life turned into a battlefield of clashing habits and unspoken tension. She woke early, humming softly as she brewed coffee in the kitchen, ignoring the fact that servants were hired for such tasks. Alexander would enter, impeccably dressed, carrying the scent of crisp cologne and authority, and frown at the sight of her using the marble counter, as if it were her own. "You know there are people paid to do that," he said one morning, his voice cool, his eyes fixed on her hands as she poured coffee into a plain ceramic mug. "I know," Isabella replied without looking up, "but I trust my own hands more than strangers. Besides, it tastes better when you make it yourself." Her words left him momentarily silent. It was such a simple notion, yet so foreign to his world. Meals together turned into verbal duels. She teased him for his rigid routines, for the way he measured his time like currency. He criticized her reckless comments, the way she rolled her eyes when he spoke too seriously. Their arguments echoed through the halls, frustrating the staff but filling the mansion with a strange kind of life it had not known before. At night, Isabella would sit on the balcony with a sketchbook in her lap, drawing the city skyline. It was her escape, her way of keeping a part of herself untouched by the coldness of the mansion. One evening, Alexander returned from a late meeting and found her there, pencil moving quickly across the page. "What are you drawing?" he asked, his tone more curious than commanding. She glanced at him, then turned the sketchbook so he could see. The lines formed a rough outline of the mansion, but not as it was. She had drawn it with vines, flowers, and open windows, alive with warmth. "This place," she said softly, "as it could be, if it were a home instead of a cage." The words struck something deep within him. He had never thought of the mansion as anything but a fortress. Yet in her eyes, even stone walls could bloom. Despite their constant friction, small moments like these began to plant seeds of change. One evening, Isabella accompanied Alexander to another business dinner. The event was stiff and formal, filled with executives in dark suits and polished smiles. She noticed how Alexander shifted into his public mask, his tone measured, his charm deliberate. When a rival executive made a sly remark about Alexander's unconventional choice of wife, Isabella reacted before Alexander could. Unconventional women tend to leave stronger marks than predictable ones, she said, her voice sharp yet calm. The table fell silent. Alexander's eyes flicked to her, and for a fleeting second, pride lit his gaze. Back at the mansion, he confronted her. "You did not need to defend me," she shrugged, hanging her coat. "I was not defending you. I was defending myself. I will not allow them to treat me like I am invisible." Her defiance once again rattled him. He was supposed to ignore her, to treat her as a temporary arrangement. But each day, she forced herself into his awareness, challenging his rules, making him question his own silence. The mansion, once a museum of cold perfection, now pulsed with the sound of two hearts colliding. And though neither of them would admit it, the line between contract and connection was already beginning to blur. The sharp edges between them did not disappear, but slowly, cracks in the armor began to show. Beneath the battles of pride and rebellion, glimpses of vulnerability began to slip through. One evening, Isabella returned home later than usual. Her clothes carried the faint smell of antiseptic, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Alexander noticed as she tried to move quietly past the grand staircase, her arms full of grocery bags. "You have been out again," he said, his voice low but firm. "Where do you go every night?" She froze, then turned toward him. "To the hospital. My mother is still there. The bills do not pay themselves. I work when I can." For the first time, Alexander saw the weariness hidden behind her defiant posture. The girl who had entered his life with fire in her eyes was carrying a quiet burden that she refused to share. He did not speak at first. He only stepped forward, taking the heavy bags from her arms with surprising gentleness. "You should have told me," he said, his tone stripped of arrogance. "And what then?" Isabella's voice cracked. "You would have written another clause in our contract. I do not need your pity, Alexander. I need to stand on my own feet." Her honesty disarmed him. He wanted to argue, to remind her that she was part of his household now, that her struggles reflected on him. But instead, he remained silent, unsettled by the realization that her strength was born from desperation, not defiance alone. Days later, Isabella caught her own glimpse of his hidden truth. She found him in his study late at night, the room dimly lit by the glow of a desk lamp. Papers were scattered across the mahogany desk, but it was not the business reports that held his attention. In his hand was a faded photograph of a younger Alexander standing beside a man with stern eyes and a rigid stance, his father. He did not notice her at first. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight, as though he were carrying the weight of the entire world. Isabella stepped closer, curiosity softening her usual sharpness. "Was that him?" she asked quietly. Alexander's head lifted, his expression hardening instinctively, but the photograph in his hand betrayed him. "Yes, my father. He believed weakness was unforgivable. He raised me to win, no matter the cost." For a moment, his voice wavered. It was the first time she heard him speak of something personal, something unpolished. She studied his face, the hard lines carved by years of discipline, and realized that beneath the marble exterior was a man molded by pressure and fear. "You are not him," she said, almost in a whisper. "You do not have to be." The words lingered in the air, unexpected even to her own ears. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes did not hold judgment or superiority. They held a flicker of something raw. That night, as Isabella returned to her room, she carried an unease she could not explain. She had seen Alexander Stone as untouchable, unbreakable, a man of control and contracts. But in that study, she had seen a son haunted by expectations, a man searching for something more than victory. And Alexander, alone with the photograph, could not forget the way her voice had cut through his defenses. He told himself it was nothing, just a slip in the walls he had built. Yet deep inside, he knew the truth. The contract was holding, but their hearts were no longer obeying its terms. The day of their official wedding celebration arrived, with a weight neither of them could ignore. The legal papers had already been signed weeks before, but the grand ceremony had been arranged for the sake of appearances. For Alexander's family and the board of directors, it was a spectacle to display stability and tradition. For Isabella, it was a performance she had agreed to play, even if her heart felt restless beneath the silken gown. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and crystal glasses. The air buzzed with polite laughter and whispers, every guest eager to witness the union of power and scandal. Isabella stood at the top of the staircase, her ivory dress cascading down in ripples of satin. She felt every eye upon her, measuring her, judging her, waiting for her to falter. Alexander met her halfway, dressed in a black tuxedo that seemed sculpted to his frame. His expression was as composed as ever. But when his hand brushed hers, Isabella caught the faintest tremor. It was not weakness, but something unfamiliar, something he had never allowed himself to feel. The vows were spoken, rehearsed words meant to appease tradition rather than hearts. Applause followed, cameras flashed, and for a moment, Isabella wondered if she had truly become nothing more than a symbol in his world of control. Yet the night was not over. When the guests had gone, when the echo of music faded and the mansion settled into silence, Alexander and Isabella found themselves alone in the bridal suite. The room was filled with flowers and candles, a stage set for intimacy, but the contract between them had promised no such thing. Isabella stood by the window, her veil removed, her shoulders tense. "We do not have to pretend now," she said quietly. "The audience is gone." Alexander loosened his tie, his gaze fixed on her. Pretending is easier when others are watching. Silence is harder. Her heart pounded at the admission. She turned to face him, expecting to see the same cold detachment, but instead, she found his eyes unguarded. There was no calculation, no performance, only the weight of a man torn between duty and something dangerously close to desire. The distance between them narrowed, not by choice, but by gravity. He reached for her hand, not as part of a contract, but as a man reaching for a truth he had denied. "You think I married you only for the throne," Alexander said, his voice low. "And perhaps that is how it began. But tonight, I cannot ignore what I see." Isabella swallowed hard, her defiance faltering beneath the intensity of his gaze. "And what do you see? A woman who is not here for money. A woman who carries fire and purity in the same breath. A woman I can no longer dismiss." The words unsettled her more than his silence ever had. She had prepared herself to be a wife in name only, to endure the whispers and the loneliness. But she had not prepared for him to look at her as though she were more than a pawn. When his lips brushed hers, it was not the kiss of a contract. It was hesitant, searching, as if he were discovering her for the very first time. She should have pulled away. Instead, she felt her walls crumble, brick by brick, against the warmth of his touch. The night that was meant to be nothing but a performance became the first step toward something real. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both knew the truth. The contract had already been broken. The sweetness of their unexpected closeness did not last long. Like a storm gathering on the horizon, whispers of doubt began to seep into their world. It started with a headline splashed across a business journal: "The Rebellious Bride. Did Alexander Stone buy himself a wife?" Photographs of Isabella entering the hospital late at night circulated online, twisted into cruel speculation. Reporters claimed she was hiding debts, chasing wealth, and exploiting Alexander's empire for her own survival. Alexander's board of directors convened in hushed urgency. "Your choice of wife is becoming a liability," one senior member said sharply. "The shareholders are nervous. Her background, her behavior, it threatens everything we built." Alexander clenched his fists beneath the table, his face unreadable. Yet when he returned home, the doubts followed him like shadows. He found Isabella in the garden, tending to flowers the servants had long neglected. She turned with a smile, but it faltered when she saw his expression. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Tell me the truth," Alexander demanded. "Did you marry me only for the money? Are the stories about your debts real?" The question pierced deeper than any insult. Isabella's chest tightened, her breath caught. "You think I sold myself to you? After everything? After what we shared?" His eyes narrowed, though conflict raged behind them. "I need to know if I have been played for a fool." Her hand trembled as she placed the gardening shears on the table. "My mother is in St. Mary's Hospital. Yes, I needed the money. But if you believe for 1 second that this was all I wanted, then you never saw me at all." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing against the marble halls. That night, Isabella packed a small bag. She left behind the satin gowns, the jewelry, and the glittering trappings of wealth. She carried only her sketchbook, and a heart splintered by betrayal. The mansion that had once felt like a prison now seemed colder than ever. Alexander stood at the top of the staircase, watching as she disappeared through the front doors. His pride chained his voice, keeping him from calling her back. Yet when the silence swallowed him whole, he felt a hollow ache he could not name. In the days that followed, the media frenzy grew. Competitors used the scandal to attack his credibility. Isabella's absence only fueled the rumors. The contract has collapsed. The bride has run away. Okay, but what the world did not see was Isabella, alone in a small apartment, working late into the night to cover the hospital bills, her sketchbook filled with drawings of a life she had once dared to imagine. She did not regret leaving the mansion. What she regretted was allowing herself to hope, and what Alexander did not admit, even to himself, was that her absence hurt more than her defiance ever had. The empire he fought to protect now felt empty, because the one person who had filled its halls with life was gone. The contract was still intact on paper, but in reality, it lay shattered just like the fragile trust between them. The truth never stayed buried for long. 1 week after Isabella left the mansion, Alexander received a sealed envelope delivered by an old nurse from St. Mary's Hospital. Inside were copies of medical receipts, every one of them signed in Isabella's handwriting. The bills were staggering, stretching back for years. Each dollar she had earned from part-time jobs, and every cent she had saved, had gone into her mother's care. The nurse's voice trembled as she spoke. She came here every night after work, sometimes skipping meals just to pay. She never once asked for charity. She only wanted to keep her mother alive with dignity. Alexander's chest tightened as guilt flooded through him. The accusations, the headlines, the doubts, suddenly, they all seemed meaningless compared to the sacrifices she had carried in silence. He remembered her words in the garden, her fire, her pain, and he realized with horror that he had been the one to break her heart. That same evening, at a press conference called to address the scandal, Alexander made a choice that stunned the room. He stood before the flashing cameras, no mask of control, no shield of indifference. "My wife is not a liability," he declared, his voice echoing across the hall. "She is not a scandal. She is the reason I understand strength in its truest form. You may question me, but do not question her, because if you do, you will answer to me." The board of directors shifted uncomfortably. The reporters scribbled furiously, but Alexander no longer cared. For the first time in his life, he spoke not as a CEO, not as a stone heir, but as a man who had finally learned what mattered. Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Isabella watched the broadcast on a flickering television. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest as his words filled the room. Her throat tightened, her eyes stung, and for the first time since leaving the mansion, she allowed herself to cry. The man who once doubted her was now fighting for her with the entire world watching. And though her heart was still wounded, a fragile seed of hope stirred within her. For Alexander, redemption was no longer a choice. It was the only path left to fight, not for the company, not for his inheritance, but for the woman he had nearly lost forever. The pressure from the board of directors did not ease after Alexander's public defense of Isabella. In fact, it grew heavier. Meetings were filled with accusations that he was letting personal feelings cloud his judgment. Shareholders whispered of instability. Some even demanded that he annul the marriage to restore confidence. But Alexander Stone had already made his choice. The following week, during the company's annual gala, a night designed to showcase power and prosperity, he decided to end the whispers once and for all. Executives, investors, and politicians filled the grand ballroom, crystal glasses in hand, their conversations dripping with speculation. Alexander walked onto the stage, his black suit impeccable, his presence commanding. Cameras turned, conversations hushed. He looked across the sea of faces, then straight into the lenses, broadcasting his words to millions. "Many of you question my marriage," he began, his voice calm but unyielding. "You question my wife, her worth, and her place beside me. Tonight, I will answer you." A ripple of unease swept through the room. "She is not a mistake. She is not a liability. She is the only person who has ever dared to tell me the truth, without fear. She is the only one who has taught me what it means to be human, not just powerful. Without her, this empire means nothing." Gasps spread among the crowd. Some frowned, Others exchanged knowing looks, but Alexander's eyes never wavered. Then he lifted his hand, holding a small object between his fingers. It was Isabella's sketchbook, the very one she had carried when she left. "This," he said, "is what she left behind. In these pages, she dreamed of turning cold stone into a home filled with life. She dreamed of love, even when the world gave her none. And I was blind enough not to see it." His voice softened, but the conviction in it was unshakable. "I see it now. I see her, and I will never let her walk away again." The room erupted in noise, some clapping, some protesting, but Alexander had made his declaration. He was no longer protecting only a company. He was protecting his wife. Outside the ballroom, Isabella stood in the shadows. She had come at the urging of a friend, uncertain whether to face the man who had once doubted her. But hearing his words, seeing him hold her sketchbook before the world, her heart trembled. When the crowd began to disperse, Alexander stepped off the stage and found her there, half hidden near the grand doors. Their eyes locked across the distance. "You came," he said, his voice rough with relief. "I wanted to see if you meant it," she whispered. He closed the space between them, every step carrying the weight of his decision. "I meant every word. I do not care about contracts, I do not care about inheritance. I care about you, Isabella. You are my choice, my only choice." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were no longer born of anger or pain. They were the fragile beginnings of healing. Before the entire hall, before the board, before the world, Alexander Stone had torn down the walls of pride and claimed his wife not as a contract, but as his heart. The storm that had once threatened to destroy them finally began to fade. The board of directors could grumble, the shareholders could whisper, but Alexander's declaration had already shifted the tide. The world now saw not a scandal, but a man who had chosen love over power, and a woman who had stood unbroken despite the weight of judgment. In the weeks that followed, Isabella returned to the mansion. But it no longer felt like a prison of glass and stone. With her presence, life seeped into every corner. The servants who once moved in silence now greeted her warmly, inspired by the way she treated them as equals. She reopened the long-ignored garden, planting roses and lilies until color bloomed where only marble had stood. The halls that once echoed with cold footsteps now carried laughter, even arguments that ended with smiles instead of silence. Alexander, too, had changed. The man who once measured every second like currency now allowed himself moments of pause. He would find Isabella sketching on the balcony and sit beside her, sometimes in silence, sometimes asking about the lines and colors she envisioned. He no longer hid the photograph of his father in his study. Instead, he placed it on a shelf, no longer as a burden but as a reminder that he could choose a different path. One evening, Alexander accompanied Isabella back to St. Mary's Hospital. Together, they met her mother, who was frail but smiling, her hand warm in Isabella's grasp. For the first time, Alexander knelt beside the bed, speaking softly to the woman who had raised the girl that had transformed his life. "You do not need to worry anymore," he told her. "Your daughter will never face the world alone again." Tears welled in the older woman's eyes as she clasped their hands together. "Then I can rest in peace, knowing she has someone who truly sees her." For Isabella, that moment meant more than any public declaration, more than the chandeliers or the applause. It was the quiet promise of a future built not on contracts, but on care. The city, too, began to view her differently. The tabloids that once smeared her name now spoke of her resilience, of her efforts at the hospital, of the way she carried herself with dignity, even in the face of cruelty. She was no longer just the rebellious bride. She had become a symbol of defiance, hope, and grace. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Alexander and Isabella walked together through the garden she had restored. He stopped beside the fountain, the water glimmering in the fading light, and turned to her. "We began with nothing but a contract," he said, his voice steady. "But every day since, you have broken every wall I built. I cannot offer you perfection, Isabella, but I can promise you truth. I can promise you love. And I can promise that I will never let you feel alone again." Her eyes glistened, her heart aching with the memory of every battle they had fought, every tear shed, every wall torn down. She placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. "I do not need perfection," she whispered. I only need you." Their lips met in a kiss that was not hesitant, not bound by duty, but free, fierce, and real. In that moment, the mansion was no longer a cage, no longer a stage for appearances. It was a home. From rebellion to redemption, from contract to commitment, their story had come full circle. The empire stood strong, but more importantly, so did their love. And as they stood together in the twilight, Alexander Stone and Isabella Reyes knew the truth that neither wealth nor power could ever deny. The greatest inheritance of all was love chosen freely, love fought for, and love made real.